Hello there, faithful listener. You've tuned in to Season 7 of the Bible Explained podcast. So make sure to grab your cup of coffee, because today we are going to be discussing the book of Acts. Well, hello and good morning, friends and faithful listeners. Today is one of the last episodes we're going to be doing in the book of Acts. We will be finishing up the book of Acts on Tuesday. Okay, and then we'll be moving into the book of Romans after that. And if you thought the book of Leviticus was difficult, just wait till we get into the book of Romans. I'm telling you, it's a very difficult book. I used to think when I was a little kid that the Old Testament was so hard to understand and so difficult. And then when I listened to the Bible completely through from beginning to end, I remember thinking when we hit the letters that Paul wrote, that they were extremely difficult, even more difficult to understand than some of the Old Testament laws. So yeah, we'll be getting into all of that, and it's going to be really, really good, I think. I'm really looking forward to discussing the book of Romans. But today, let's go ahead and read Acts 28:11 through 22 and discuss more of Paul's travels. I will be reading out of the WEB as usual. After 3 months, we set sail in a ship of Alexandria, which had wintered in the island, whose sign was the Twin Brothers. Touching at Syracuse, we stayed there 3 days. From there, we circled around and arrived at Rhegium. After 1 day, a south wind sprang up, and on the second day, we came to Puteoli, where we found brothers, and were entreated to stay with them for 7 days. So we came to Rome. From there, the brothers, when they heard of us, came to meet us as far as the market of Appius and the 3 taverns. When Paul saw them, he thanked God and took courage. When we entered into Rome, the centurion delivered the prisoners to the captain of the guard, but Paul was allowed to stay by himself with the soldier who guarded him. After 3 days, Paul called together those who were the leaders of the Jews. When they had come together, he said to them, "I, brothers, though I had done nothing against the people or the customs of our fathers, still was delivered prisoner from Jerusalem into the hands of the Romans, who, when they had examined me, desired to set me free, because there was no cause of death in me. But when the Jews spoke against it, I was constrained to appeal to Caesar, not that I had anything about which to accuse my nation. For this cause, therefore, I asked to see you, and to speak with you, for because of the hope of Israel, I am bound with this chain." They said to him, "We neither received letters from Judea concerning you, nor did any of the brothers come here and report or speak any evil of you. But we desire to hear from you what you think. For as concerning this sect, it is known to us that everywhere it is spoken against." All right, faithful listeners, as usual, you're going to have to forgive my pronunciation of these Italian words. I read the word Puteoli, and I think that is how you pronounce it. I don't know. For those of you who can actually speak Italian, I am extremely sorry. So on Tuesday, we talked about the shipwreck that happened, and Paul and Luke and the other prisoners, along with the Roman guards, landed on a particular island. And I mentioned how some people think that Paul landed on the island of Malta, and other people think that Paul landed on the island of Mljet. Malta is right underneath Sicily. Whereas if you're looking at a map of Italy, and you see the boot of Italy there, Mljet is on the eastern side of the boot of Italy across the Adriatic Sea there, right near Bosnia. And there's some debate whether or not Paul landed on Mljet or Malta. But personally, I think that Paul landed on Malta. And I did not state my opinion the other day, because we're going to talk about it today, because we're going to be delving into some geography here. It says here that after 3 months, we set sail in a ship of Alexandria, which had wintered on the island, whose sign was the Twin Brothers. So finally, after 3 months, the seas are now calm again, calm enough so that ships can begin to sail. So on the island, they discovered a ship that was going up to Rome, another grain ship. So all of the prisoners and the Roman guards get on board this ship called the Twin Brothers. And here's what it says in verse 12. Touching at Syracuse, we stayed there 3 days. And this is where I'm going to bring up my little map here. And I am looking at a map of Italy, Sicily, Malta, and Mljet. Here's the thing. If Paul and the others landed on the island of Mljet across the Adriatic Sea, to me it would make no sense for them to go around the boot of Italy down to Syracuse, which is at the southern tip of Sicily. However, Malta is very close to Syracuse, and that is why I believe that Paul landed on the island of Malta, because of what we are reading today. Malta just makes a lot more sense based upon the travels that we read about today. Syracuse is very close to Malta, just a hop, skip, and a jump away, whereas Mljet is hundreds of miles away from Syracuse. And now that I'm looking at the map, it would just make a lot more sense if Paul had landed on Mljet for them to just cross the Adriatic Sea, like in a horizontal way, and land on the eastern side of Italy near Pescara, and then travel by land to Rome. That just makes a lot more sense instead of going all the way around the boot of Italy. So yes, that is why I believe that Paul landed on the island of Malta. And if you're curious about why people think Paul might have landed on the island of Mljet, check out Tuesday's episode. So it says that they touched at Syracuse and stayed there 3 days. From there, we circled around and arrived at Rhegium. And Rhegium is a area that I believe is right on the tip of the boot of Italy. And then after 1 day, a south wind sprang up, and on the second day, we came to Puteoli, which means the boat was moving up the peninsula of Italy, making its way slowly to Rome. But at the city of Puteoli, they find some brothers and take a pit stop at this city. They were entreated to stay with them for 7 days. So all of these prisoners and the Roman guards were given a place to stay by the Christians of this city in Italy. And they were able to have a week of relaxation before finally getting to Rome. Rest and relaxation is extremely important. And here in America, it is not something that people typically prioritize, is rest and relaxation. But yet, it says in Scripture that God is the God of rest. In fact, if you look at all of the Jewish holidays back in the Old Testament that God instituted for his people, they had a ton of days off. And don't forget that God commanded the people also to take the Sabbath day off. Every single week, the people were to take a Sabbath day. Rest and relaxation is extremely important, and that is why there are tons of verses in Scripture that tell Christians that they are to be hospitable to people, that they are to give rest to other people. Because since we follow God, who is the God of rest and relaxation, we are supposed to be emulating that to other people. So these Christians in Puteoli ended up being a huge blessing to Paul and the other prisoners, and even to the Roman guards. This was a great time for Paul to rest before he is about to get to Rome and have to do something very grueling, which is to go to Caesar and make his case before Caesar, not to mention making his case to the Jewish leaders that he is about to make his case to in Rome as well. So relaxation and rest is extremely important. And it is also important for us as Christians to give it to other people when we can also. So thankfully, Paul finds rest in Puteoli. And from there, it says they went to Rome after 7 days. It says that when the brothers heard of us, they came to meet us as far as the market of Appius and the 3 taverns. This means that the people of Rome, when they heard that Paul was coming, actually gave him a procession like a king would get. Apparently, back in these days, if somebody was to be honored, a bunch of people from the city would go out and meet the person that was coming into the city and guide them through the city. That was one of the ways to show somebody honor back in ancient days. Actually, kind of similar to nowadays as well, honestly. But that was what they did for Paul. The Christians came out and honored Paul by giving him basically a tour of the city, even though Paul was still in chains at this point in time. I can imagine that the guards are seeing all of this and are hearing the gospel message being preached to them from all of these Christians who are being so hospitable to Paul and all of the other prisoners, and even to the Roman guards themselves. Then in verse 15, when Paul saw these Christians, he thanked God and took courage. This shows something. Paul struggled with fear many times previous to this. We can see that he did because God often came to Paul and said, Paul, take courage. Do not be afraid. And Paul himself actually asked people to pray for him so that he would be courageous to preach God's word when the time came. So Paul being outside of the city of Rome, traveling in, was probably really, really scared. But then these Christians who come out to meet Paul encouraged Paul. And he thanked God for these Christians. So these Christians were a godsend to Paul. They were encouraging. They were providing him a place to stay. They were giving him rest. And that is what a Christian is supposed to do. We are supposed to supply peace and rest to other people. When we entered into Rome, the centurion delivered the prisoners to the captain of the guard, and Paul was allowed to stay by himself with the soldier who guarded him. So finally, now that they are in Rome, the centurion who was stuck with Paul on that shipwreck finally gets to finish his job and go home. You can imagine this guy was just like, oh my gosh, get me home. I just want to be at home. And he finally gets the chance to do so. The centurion finishes his job, says goodbye to Paul, and Paul is now turned over to the captain of the guard. And Paul actually was allowed to stay by himself. The other prisoners were not. But Paul, because of his good attitude, was basically just under house arrest. He was allowed to stay in a house by himself with one soldier guarding him. Now, this still wouldn't have been fun, though, because this soldier would have always been around, chained to Paul. And then when that soldier was done with his shift, another soldier would come in and chain himself to Paul. So still, this was not a fun position for Paul to be in, but it was better than the other prisoners who had been with Paul on that ship. But the good thing about this was that this gave Paul an opportunity to minister to the soldier that was chained to him, because this soldier couldn't go anywhere. This soldier would have to listen to what Paul was saying. That was his job. And he wasn't allowed to hurt Paul either. So this soldier is probably getting the gospel message thrown at him like every 10 minutes from Paul. And the soldier could do nothing about it. He just had to sit there and listen. And I'm sure Paul was taking every opportunity he could to actually witness to these soldiers that were chained to him. So it says that after 3 days, Paul called together those who were the leaders of the Jews. So it seems that there was a lot of Jews in the city of Rome, Rome being a huge ancient city, obviously. A lot of people lived there. So Paul calls together the leaders of the Jews in Rome. So they all came together, and it only took 3 days, Paul being one of the biggest figures at this time for the Christian faith. I'm sure the Jews of Rome were very interested in speaking to Paul. So Paul says to them, I, brothers, though I had done nothing against the people or the customs of our fathers, still was delivered prisoner from Jerusalem into the hands of the Romans, who, when they had examined me, desired to set me free because there was no cause of death in me. So first and foremost, he calls himself a brother to the Jews. And that would have been very important, I think, for the Jews to hear this, because Paul, even though he was a Christian, he was not making himself better than the Jewish people of Rome. Instead, he was making himself equal with them, calling them brothers. And he's like, look, I'm chained up, and there's no reason for me to be chained up. Even the Romans know that I have done nothing wrong, but they wanted to do a favor to the Jews. It says, the Jews spoke against freeing me, so I was constrained to appeal to Caesar. Not that I had anything about which to accuse my nation. So he's like, I had to appeal to Caesar because the Jews down in Caesarea really want to kill me. And in order for me to get out of that situation, I had to appeal to Caesar. I did not want to appeal to Caesar, and also I'm not appealing to him to try to hurt my fellow Jews. Rather, I'm appealing to Caesar to save my own life because I am chained up unjustly. He says, for this cause I asked to see you and to speak with you, for because of the hope of Israel I am bound with this chain. Paul says that Jesus is the hope of Israel, and that is why he is bound with chains, because the Jewish people did not want to hear that Jesus was the hope of the Israelites. So the Jewish people say to him, we neither received letters from Judea concerning you, nor did any of the brothers come here and report or speak any evil of you. And this is pretty funny because this means that nobody had anything against Paul. Remember how a few chapters ago, Governor Festus said this exact same thing. He was like, I don't really have anything to write about regarding Paul. So I need to think up something. But it turns out he didn't think anything up because no letters came along with Paul to accuse him of anything. So Paul came alone with no accusations against him. And even the Jews in Judea couldn't send any letters of anything to accuse Paul of. They had nothing. So that alone should have proven that Paul was completely innocent. But the Jewish leaders in Rome don't immediately admit that Paul is free of any guilt. Instead, they said, we desire to hear what you think. For as concerning this sect, as it is known to us, that everywhere it is spoken against. So he's like, yeah, we want to hear, Paul, what you have to say about this Christianity sect, because we hear a lot about it. We don't really know much about it, but we know that everybody hates it. So we'd like to hear what you have to say regarding this Christianity thing. And it's really funny. Once again, they call it a sect. This is not the first time we see Christianity being referred to as a sect, which is funny because it was much, much bigger than a sect. Because if you think about it, in just these few short verses that we read about, Paul was encountering Christians in every city in Italy, pretty much. Cities that Paul hadn't even been to, he's finding Christians in that are taking him in and encouraging him and providing him with a place to stay and providing him with rest. This was way, way bigger than a sect. And now Christianity is one of the biggest religions throughout the entire world. And as Christians, we are supposed to be living in the way that God calls us to live. Paul says, Jesus is the hope of Israel. And in fact, it is not sacrilegious for me to say that Jesus is the hope of the entire world. And as Christians, aka little Christs, we are to be living in the way that Christ calls us to live and spreading hope to the entire world. And as we finish up the book of Acts next week, we are going to be moving into the book of Romans and really talking about how Christians are to be living with the hope that we have from Jesus Christ. So faithful listeners, make sure to tune into Tuesday's episode because that will be the last episode that we do in the book of Acts. And I hope that you all enjoyed the book of Acts. And if you did, make sure you rate the podcast and tell people that the Bible Explained podcast exists. But faithful listeners, I will see you all tomorrow for an episode out of the Old Testament, because on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays, I do an episode out of the Old Testament, and we will be discussing more about some of the trials of David fleeing from Saul. So that'll be a great episode. I hope to see you then, 6 a.m. or whenever you choose to wake up and listen. Happy listening, and God bless.